Hello students. So in the previous class we have discussed about the friction as well as factors affecting the friction. So let us summarize what we have discussed. So friction. So first thing we have discussed about what is friction. What is the friction force or frictional force? This friction is nothing but it is the opposite, the force which opposes the direction of motion of an object. For example, this object is moving in this direction means the frictional force will be acting opposite to the direction of motion. In this direction the force is applying and the frictional force is applying in opposite direction in equal in magnitude. That means in equal in the same force, a frictional force is acting on an object. Now after that we have discussed about the factors which affects the friction. That means we have known when the when the two surfaces in contact with each other, then their frictional force will be more among that. Now imagine that if there is no frictional force means then the moving object will be always moving. So that is not possible. That means you are just imagining that if there is no frictional force, that means if there is no opposite force to the object which is moving, then the object will be moving itself. So these are the topics we have discussed previously. So based on these conditions, we have to discuss how we are going to reduce the friction. Isn't it? We have to reduce the friction because it opposes the direction of motion. If it is opposing the direction of motion means we have to reduce the friction. How to reduce the friction? We have to know before we have reducing the friction, we have to know what are the types of frictions are there. Actually, there are three types of frictions are there. So what are the three types of friction is under that? First, it is static friction. So second one is sliding friction. And the third one is rolling friction. So these are the three types of friction. So static friction, sliding friction and as well as rolling friction is. So if you know what is static friction, what is sliding friction and what is rolling friction, then you are able to say how we are going to reduce the friction. If you know these concepts, then you are only able to say how we are going to reduce the friction which is opposing the direction of motion. Okay, so let us study about the first thing, that is static friction. So what is this static friction? So here to explain all these three cases, that is all these three types, I am going to use only the one example which is common for both for these three, that is static, sliding as well as rolling friction. So understand this, I will be taking one box, a harder box or a very weighting box I am considering here. So I am pushing. So one fellow is here, he is pushing this box. That means he is applying force to that box in this direction. I am considering that force as 1 Newton. Okay, you know what is the SI unit of force? It is Newton. So how much force does this fellow is applying to this box? He is applying 1 Newton of force to this box. So you know this is a ground. This is a ground here. So if the box is rolling, then there will be a, if the ball is, we have to, if I are applying force to that box means, then there will be a opposite force which is applying on that box. That opposite force is known as frictional force. That frictional force, small f I will consider, that force will be in same. That means how much amount you are applying the force, the same amount of frictional force is applying opposite to the opposite to your motion. That means it is also applying 1 Newton of frictional force opposite to the force which you are applying. Similarly, now you are going to increase it. To overcome the frictional force, you are going to increase it to the 2 Newton. If you are going to increase into the 2 Newton, again the frictional force is going to increase by 2 Newton. That means in these cases, whatever you are applying the force in the same direction, same value, with the same value in the opposite direction, frictional force is also acting. So that means this won't be a constant for all the time. At some certain condition or at certain point, when you increase the force, that means when you increase the applied force, this force what you are applying on the object is called the applied force. When you increase the applied force to some extent, for example, if you increase for the 3 Newton, then the object or the body which is there which starts moving. That means it overcome the frictional force which is acting in opposite direction. Okay, so always the applied force and frictional force won't be a constant. At certain time, it overcome, the applied force overcome the frictional force, so that the object which is in rest position will start moving. So this type of friction is called static friction. So static means rest or the constant. So what is the definition? What is the definition of static frictional force? Means frictional force which is applied on a stationary body. So what is static friction? So frictional force applied on a stationary body, or the stationary body is nothing but a body which is in rest position is called the static friction. Okay. So this static friction is nothing but, once again I'll repeat it, it is a frictional force which is applied on a object which is at rest position. So next, when the object starts moving, that friction we are going to say it as a sliding friction. So what is this sliding friction means? Static means the frictional force which is acting on an object which is at rest position. Sliding friction means whenever an object has been moving, that means a frictional force. So what is the definition? I can say a frictional force on a moving body. So with the force which is on a moving body is called the sliding friction. Okay, so sliding friction is applicable only when an object is in moving. So to understand it, you can take example of the same box. So for example, a box is at rest position, means you have to apply more force to that box, isn't it? The same condition you can consider here when a body is moving. For example, the same body object is moving means then force applied for that object to be in that means to be in a motion position, it is very easy, isn't it? So that what I can say, that is static friction is less than the sliding friction, isn't it? So here force application, force which is applied in the case of static friction is more compared to the sliding friction, isn't it? Force applied in a sliding friction is less compared to static friction. Why? Because to change from rest position to motion position, we have to apply more force in the case of static friction. That means the object which is in a rest position. If the object is moving, that means the object which is already in a motion means, then the force applied for that object to continue in a motion position, that force will be less compared to the force which you are applying in a static friction. So I can say static friction is less than the sliding friction. So what I can conclude by the static and sliding friction means I can replace static friction by sliding friction, isn't it? If I want to apply more force means I have to overcome from more force to less force. How I am going to replace it? I am replacing the static friction by the sliding friction. Okay, similar to this one, the last thing. What is the another one types of friction is? It is rolling friction. So what is this rolling friction means? Take the same example of a wooden block or anything on the surface. So instead of this, I am placing a wooden block with the wheel here. I am placing two wheels on the opposite sides of the wooden block. So now what happens? Now the force which I am applying will be less to overcome the frictional force, isn't it? So it is what I can say, it can reduce the friction. So if I replace this flat surface by a wheel means, then the friction which is applying in the opposite direction will be reduced in that object. So what I can conclude by this one means, first I have said static friction is less than the sliding friction. So next I can conclude sliding friction is less than the rolling friction. Why? Because means compared to the sliding friction, the force which I am applying when I have replaced by a roll, that means when I replaced by a wheel, is less. So force which I am applying on a rolling friction is less compared to sliding friction, is less compared to the static friction. So I can replace static friction by sliding friction by rolling friction. Okay, so that is why in the most of the suitcases and all, you can see it, you are going to use the wheels there. Why wheels are used means wheels reduce the friction. Now how these static has been reduced by sliding, and this sliding friction has been reduced by the rolling friction means, this is due to the main concept which we have discussed about irregularities on the surfaces. You know, this is a surface and another one object. So object which is placed here. These two surfaces, you know, they will get in contact with each other. That is in the case of static friction, with the object is in rest position. If the object is rest position, there will be interlocking takes place between the surface of the ground and the object surface. Now in the case of sliding friction, when the object is in moving means the interlocking between the surface and the object will be reduced. Okay, so interlocking the timings for the interlocking will be reduced because the object will be moving and the these two surfaces won't get in contact with each other. Now in the case of rolling friction, this is the rough surface, that is in the surface means the object will just slide over or just roll over that, so that there won't be any contact between them. That means the contact between the surface and the rolling of the wheel just slide up. So that is why they will be in contact, but it will be slide up in the case of the rolling friction. So that is why we are going to use, most of the cases we are going to replace sliding friction by the rolling friction. How we are going to use the rolling friction? We are using wheels to reduce the friction. Okay, so this is a very important thing, how we are going to reduce the friction. If there is a friction means that is also useful and that is also harmful, isn't it? Useful means whenever, that only I am saying, if there is no friction is there means the object which is in moving, that will be in a motion position itself. So that means that is one of the use of a friction. Another one, what is the disadvantage of a friction means, the object which is in rest position, it is very difficult to change its position. That means we have to apply more force on that object. So that is why we are replacing static friction by the sliding friction, and whenever the object is in moving means you can change that sliding friction by a wheels that reduces the friction. Okay, so I hope everyone have clearly understand about the types of friction, that is static, sliding and as well as rolling friction. So based on these topics I have given you the worksheet. Try to do it. If any doubts is there, we shall discuss in a class. Thank you.